have to be able to energize and excite what has been one of the most important parts of the Democratic coalition.
So you're talking about the black vote?
Brad Pitt riding a horse. Sign me up.
President Trump's pick to be the next vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Hyten, appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee for his confirmation hearing, where he was set to be grilled publicly about allegations of sexual assault by Army Colonel Catherine Spletstoser. But luckily for Hyten, he was in front of a sympathetic crowd.
Sexual assault happens in the military. It just didn't happen in this case.
Chinese government officials in Xinjiang say 90% of the Uyghurs held in camps are now free and, quote, living happily with an impressive income. But it's hard to take that at face value. When satellite images of detention centers were publicized, the Chinese government pivoted from denying they were detaining as many as 1 million members of the Muslim minority to claiming they were just educating them in vocational training centers. Thousands of people protested across Sudan after security forces in Al Abyad opened fire on students demonstrating against fuel and bread shortages on Monday, killing 4 teenagers. The ruling military council was set to meet with civilian leaders today in order to finalize a power-sharing agreement. Now those talks have been postponed, and authorities have ordered schools across the country to suspend classes indefinitely. Federal prosecutors charged a 33-year-old software engineer with 1 count of computer fraud and abuse for allegedly hacking Capital One's servers. According to a court filing, Paige Thompson boasted about the hack in an online forum. The bank says she stole the personal information of around 100 million Americans and 6 million Canadians who applied for credit cards from as early as 2005.
Democrats are now in Detroit for 2 nights of long, crowded, and occasionally awkward debates. Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders will be the ones to watch tonight. But the real show is tomorrow. Joe Biden says he's ready to defend his record on civil rights and criminal justice, unlike last time.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America? Then, no. Do you agree?
But this time, the attacks won't only be coming from Kamala Harris. Cory Booker will be coming for Biden too.
My ancestors are from a small island to the south of Italy called Africa. You know what? I got some people from there.
You got some people there?
Yeah. Wow, we might be related. Yeah.
Cory Booker's in Michigan, doing what he's done for a lot of the campaign, talking directly to his party's most reliable voting bloc.
Hi, how are you?
A lot of candidates are talking frankly about the issues facing black and brown people in America. But perhaps no one does this more than Booker.
When it comes to issues of systematic economic disempowerment, when it comes to issues of gun violence or attacks on public education, we must be ready to bring a fight not just to the election, but to actually getting transformative things done from Washington to our communities.
And he's got the policy proposals to back it up. His so-called baby bonds program is designed to shrink the racial wealth gap.
Tell me about baby bonds.
Baby bonds is actually an idea that, interestingly, has come from think tanks on both sides of the aisle. And that's the simple idea that if every American, as a birthright, gets $1,000 into an interest-bearing account, and depending on your family's income, every year going up to 18, you can have up to $2,000 placed in the account. So the lowest income Americans would get $2,000.
He's also sponsored a bill to study reparations.
We as a nation have not yet truly acknowledged and grappled with racism and white supremacy that has tainted this country's founding and continues to persist in those deep racial disparities and inequalities today.
You talked a lot about how important black voters are in this election. Do you feel like that's more important to concentrate on than say white voters?
What I'm saying is that all voters are what we have to focus on in the Democratic Party. And that means, yes, going after all demographics, but it's also understanding that we have to be able to energize and excite what has been one of the most important parts of the Democratic coalition in terms of populations that vote at high percentages for Democrats.
So you're talking about the black vote?
We need to have a candidate that can authentically engage and excite and energize our full coalition.
Rock and roll, folks.
But Democrats are increasingly less shy about talking about racism, and Booker's starting to be overshadowed by other candidates. Right now, he's polling at about 2%.
It seems like in this, especially in the primary, that race is going to be a topic for the entire election. For a lot of candidates, they're kind of starting to position themselves not only against Trump, but against other candidates. For example, against Biden. You started to do this, Kamala Harris has started to do this. It's worked out very well for Kamala Harris. It hasn't, your numbers haven't been popping off like hers have.
You're looking at this through polling 200 days away from the Iowa primaries. I'm looking at this about what's important for the Democratic Party right now, no matter who is the nominee. And if you can't have a conversation with a race without insulting folks, or you can't even, it takes you years, decades to even say, hey, maybe I made a mistake on that 1994 crime bill, which put mass incarceration just on steroids. These are the kind of things that I find problematic, period.
Cory Booker also knows that talking about racism can be a tougher sell in places like Iowa. So his stump speech is broader here, with calls for unity and stories about kind-hearted white folks who are on the right side of history.
I am here because of us, because of ordinary Americans who in times of moral crisis did extraordinary things for the cause of our country. They didn't divide this nation. They didn't pit us against each other. This election is not a small election about one person in one office. It is a big election about the culture and the values and the principles of America.
I feel almost like there's a couple Cory Bookers here. There's the Cory Booker who has prided himself, and publicly so, right, on being able to be very bipartisan, right? There's also one who I think is very attractive within the Democratic primary, who's talking about things like social justice, who's talking about things like criminal justice reform, who's talking about reparations. Are we gonna see the same Cory Booker in a general election?
First of all, I don't see two. I see that the same person. I am the same person, general elections, primary elections, and I had a tough primary in my Senate race. And the person people are seeing now is a person people are going to be seeing as the nominee for the Democratic Party to be the next president of the United States.
And that'll be Booker's challenge in tomorrow's debate and through the rest of the campaign.
How are you?
Stay on one message, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
I will make the case that why are we in politics but to address injustices and advance opportunities. And my loyalty will always lie with the communities that have put me into politics.
In order to get there, you have to get past the politics of election time.
I don't want to ascend to the presidency and lose my soul on the way. This is an election where I'm telling people who I am, what my values are, which I think are American values, and what I intend to do as president of the United States. And if that doesn't satisfy voters, and then fine. But I'm going to run this my way, because the worst thing that can happen is me trying to contort myself to something I'm not.
Thank you, everybody.
When the Democratic presidential candidates take the stage tonight for the second round of debates, they'll likely be asked a version of this question.
Raise your hand if your government plan would provide coverage for undocumented immigrants.
And if they all answer as they did the first time, it'll be a potent sign of how far left the Democratic Party has moved on immigration over the past decade. That's because under current law, even legal immigrants aren't eligible for federal government programs like Medicaid and Medicare until they've been in the country for 5 years. So the candidates want to give undocumented immigrants benefits that, at the moment, lots of legal immigrants aren't even eligible for. The candidates are also proposing the U.S. be more generous than most other developed countries are, even though those countries all have some form of national health insurance. In countries like Canada and Britain, for instance, only legal residents are eligible for insurance. Other countries, like France and Belgium, provide healthcare to undocumented immigrants, but do so by setting up separate healthcare plans. Germany, similarly, only offers the undocumented a limited range of medical benefits. Doing more than what these other countries do sounds expensive, and it would be. Take two potential ways of covering all undocumented immigrants. There are an estimated 11.5 million undocumented immigrants in the US, and roughly half are estimated to not have insurance. So if we just enrolled the uninsured in Medicaid, it would cost about $40 billion. If instead, we end up adopting something like Bernie Sanders' single-payer plan, which would enroll all Americans in government-funded insurance, it'll cost an estimated $80 billion. Either way, it won't be cheap. It also won't be popular. A PBS and Marist poll released last week showed that just a third of all voters support health insurance for undocumented immigrants. And a CBS News survey of Democratic voters in the first 18 primary states found that self-described moderate to conservative Democrats opposed 61 to 39. So given all this, why are Democratic candidates in favor of the idea? Perhaps it's simply because they think it's the right thing to do. But there's also another reason. Offering health insurance to the undocumented is incredibly popular with very liberal Democrats, who have a lot of sway in the primaries. So in an attempt to win the nomination, candidates are offering up plans that liberals like, even if voters as a whole don't.
Everyone knows what a border is. It's the line that divides one country from another. And here in the US, there's only one border anyone ever talks about. The border, the one between us and Mexico. President Trump is obsessed with the border, obviously. And from the start, his obsession has taken the most literal form it can take. A big, crude, physical expression of that line between us and them, the wall. Congress may not see the point. But last week, the Supreme Court decided 5-4 to allow the administration to divert about $2.5 billion in Pentagon money to replace fencing in Arizona, Texas, and California. That gives Trump a symbolic victory to sell to voters in 2020. Meanwhile, members of his administration are transforming and expanding the border in ways that aren't just symbolic. The most recent step came on Friday, when the governments of Guatemala and the US signed what's known as a Safe Third Country Agreement.
So that's a very big thing. It's a very important signature. Never been done before.
The details are still sketchy, and it may get stopped by the courts. But the idea is that the US will be able to reject and immediately deport any asylum seekers who travel through Guatemala but don't seek asylum there first.
If we look at last year's numbers, over 60,000 people from Honduras and El Salvador requested asylum in the United States. And so we're talking about tens of thousands of people that would be impeded from that possibility. I mean, I think what we're seeing is an attempt by the Trump administration to extend its own border all the way to Central America at a minimum.
What that means is that if you think about the border as a system that determines who gets to enter and stay in the US, then it's a lot bigger than that line between two countries. Let's say you're a migrant from Honduras, and you're trying to make your way to McAllen, Texas. If and when this new agreement goes into effect, you will encounter your first legal barrier to entering the US the moment you enter Guatemala. That's more than 1,400 miles away from the fences that Trump is going to rebuild. If you do get through Guatemala, you may run into thousands of National Guard troops that the Mexican government recently deployed with the explicit purpose of keeping migrants like you from reaching the US. These are Mexican troops, but they're a direct extension of American policy. They're basically deputies of the US Border Patrol. That encounter with the American border enforcement machine could happen as far as 1,000 miles from the border. But let's say you do make it to McAllen. Let's actually say you make it a lot farther, all the way to Wichita, about as far away from any border as you can get. Guess what? You still haven't left the border behind. As of last week, an undocumented person arrested anywhere in the country can be deported immediately without a court hearing, unless they prove they've lived here for over 2 years. That process, called expedited removal, used to only apply to people apprehended within 100 miles of either the Mexican or Canadian borders. Now it applies all over the US. So it may well be that Trump will get to build his wall. But if you're the type of migrant Donald Trump doesn't like, then that wall is just one tiny slice of a vast and growing zone designed to keep you out.
Police pepper sprayed a group of protesters who gathered outside of the Kwai Chung police station today. to express solidarity with 62 protesters arrested for their alleged role in this weekend's demonstrations. 44 for the charge of rioting. The grievances of pro-democracy protesters has grown to include police tactics. They see rioting charges that come with up to 10 years in prison as a way to criminalize their right to be heard. A movement that began with orderly marches against an extradition law looked strikingly different this weekend. Unruly gatherings ended in clashes and began in direct defiance of police, who denied their permits for the first time. Saturday's protest targeted Yuen Long, the same neighborhood where last week a mob of men in white attacked protesters heading home. The victims said the police were slow to arrive. This time, police showed up quickly. Then, on Sunday, protesters marched against police violence. They didn't stick to approved routes. Once again, confronted riot police, who used the same tactics that inspired the protest itself. China responded yesterday with a vague statement that if the, quote, chaos continues, all of Hong Kong will suffer. But there seems to be no end to the cycle of protests and police violence. More demonstrations and a citywide strike are set for next week.
It's my pleasure.
Fuck me up!
Call me Marvin. Put it there.
God. Talk about star power in a film.
Oh, the shooting.
Brad Pitt riding a horse. Sign me up.
All right, what's the matter, partner?
Sorry, stop this for a second. I don't even want to talk over it because I just love Tarantino so much, you know? I think this movie looks like a love letter to cinema, right? Particularly the golden age of it. I think this movie's for you. Well, those are the last movie stars, aren't there? They're the last of their breed. The Leos, the Brad Pitts. Let's think on that while we watch the next piece.
Okay. The South won the war?
That's right. This is something you want to keep under your hat till you're ready to
Seems
not
like
keep
pretty
it under
big
your
news.
hat.
Oh, I love that guy. He just has such a great fuck you attitude towards life.
We're looking for a sword.
All right.
Sword.
Why was that so hard?
It wasn't hard.
Wasn't hard.
Why did we have to take that route to get there?
30 seconds to get there. It wasn't that long.
Loose, funny. Everyone on screen is just having fun. I'll tell you what, though, when whoever said it is super tiny, you know, it's WXKY News, Delaware. No offense to Delawareans.
Best way to do this is through concrete evidence.
Is this Antique Roadshow for racists?
This movie's for everybody that believes in pawning shit and love and Mark Maron's mustache. And Mark Maron's mustache is something I believe in. Oh man, that's not creepy at all.
You know the jungle. It's a part of you. But exploring is not a game. And you don't look.
Did he just say the jungle is a part of you? Oh! Dora! They're like, who is every Latin actor that we can find? You missed the spot, bro.
It's now or never.
For a kid's movie, this looks really like action-packed, man. Arturo Castro? No, I didn't see that in the credits. That's weird. He must have forgot to put it there. I'm really happy that this sort of stuff exists. I never saw people that looked like me when I was growing up in films. And if they did look like me, Antonio Banderas was shooting them, you know what I mean? I'm so stoked for this one, man.